Rev John the man who I was talking about earlier. He has really, really good commentaries each week for the lectionary theme. This is a little bit of extra background. In Mosaic law, they had what they called the year of Jubilee. And if you were in debt, after 50 years in the year of Jubilee, your debt was completely written off. Had to live a long time to have the debt removed. But this was a principle in Israeli law, or the law of Moses, that people would not have to live with their debt forever. It could be cancelled. So that's part of the background to this. And John Vanderlaar writes, "The immediate thought that comes to mind when thinking about this week's theme is the issue of foreign debt and the corrupt system of international finance and trade regulations that has left so many third world countries irreversibly impoverished. The call of God's generous and inappropriate grace cannot be mistaken. There needs to be a rising up of God's jubilee. People calling for these debts to be written off and for effective aid to be offered where needed. But it also goes further than this. For those of us in wealthy countries, there is a tremendous responsibility to watch how we use our wealth and opportunity. We need to avoid anything that is exploitive, using our buying power to ensure that fair trade practices are employed and fair wages are paid to those who produce what we use, and that the impact on our planet is likewise just and sustainable. When we use our opportunity to accumulate wealth for ourselves, we are essentially dishonourable. But when we use it to uplift others, we bring honour and dignity both to them and to ourselves. As Reverend Dr. Muvan Dandala once said, the opposite of poverty is not wealth, it is dignity. That's just a little sample of his commentary, which gives us a lot to think about in our context today. So, as Jesus continues towards Jerusalem in Luke chapter 15 and 16, he's teaching his followers about discipleship. And in today's lectionary reading from chapter 16, he tells this puzzling parable about a dishonest steward, or if you like, a shrewd manager, keeping in the background the Pharisees, who were lovers of money. Commentators agree that this parable is one of the most challenging texts in the New Testament, but it is still very relevant today in a world where the very poor, people and nations are so trapped in debt to the rich that they will never be freed of that burden. Jesus talked a lot about money. Many of the crowds who followed Jesus were poor and they were exploited by the rich, and this story would have grabbed their attention. At first glance, the story seems to commend the dishonest manager for his dishonesty. But is that the point of the parable? How are we to understand it? The manager, acting on behalf of his master, negotiated and signed contracts for the rich man, probably an absentee landlord. His job was to make money for his master, and he did this by charging interest on loans, which was actually forbidden by the Mosaic law, so that one debtor received 50 jugs of olive oil, but the bill was for 100. So the master heard about his manager's dishonest practice and called him to account. His strategy that was one that would provide for his own survival and would appease his master. So his plan, as we heard, was to cancel the extra or the forbidden interest, which significantly reduced the debt. So the debtors would believe that the rich man was actually being generous, and the manager would have friends. In Luke's parables, we find dynamic characters like the manager who had mixed motives. His shrewdness lay in his ability to recognise and deal with his own crisis in a move which the rich man applauded. Ashamed to beg and not willing to take out a labourer's job digging the roads, he was wise enough to know when his status could no longer be sustained. So the rich man had a dilemma. What would he do with this dishonest, shrewd manager? He could either expose the dishonest manager for his dishonest deal and demand that each debtor make full payment, which would show him up as a greedy lawbreaker. Or the rich man could forego the extra income his manager had made for him, overlook his unlawful dealings, and be seen by his debtors and community as a generous man. So he certainly had a dilemma, and this is what he did. He goes along with forgiving the debt, praises the manager for his shrewdness in handling a difficult situation. Now, both the manager and the master were businessmen, and both were motivated by money-making decisions that would produce a favourable income for them both. Both of them were concerned about appearances and reputation. Once upon a time, a woman was attending a fundraiser for an organisation which supported children with muscular dystrophy. An indoor swimming pool was badly needed for water therapy. It was very expensive. The woman was moved by the story and wrote a cheque for a very large sum of money. She was glad that she was able to be generous, but her husband was not pleased. She hadn't consulted him, and he had worked overtime so that money could be made for their Europe trip for their 25th wedding anniversary. He said to her, "Get in the car, we're going back down there and you're going to make them give back the money." His wife was really embarrassed as she explained what had happened to the director of the organisation. He was devastated, but he retrieved the cheque, and as he handed it back, one of the boys in a wheelchair was with her husband. One of the boys in a wheelchair was with her husband. The boy's mum said to her son, "Honey, this is the man who has given all that money to help build the pool." The little boy took the husband's hand and smiled and said, "Thank you." The husband was stopped in his tracks and managed, "You're welcome." Then he wrote an even bigger cheque. Like the shrewd manager, under pressure, this man had the capacity to act graciously, for he too was concerned for his own reputation. So, how are we to understand this difficult parable? There are several ways to interpret it. One way is to explore Jesus' teaching immediately after this parable. And be aware that Luke is not encouraging the abuse of financial obligations, as verse 9 might suggest. In verse 10 to 12, Jesus challenges his followers to be creative in their use of material possessions for eternal or kingdom purposes. So Jesus contrasts worldly wealth with true riches. He does not confuse the two. Jesus warns that no one can serve two masters. If money is your master, then God cannot be. If God is your master, then money cannot be. You cannot serve both God and material wealth at the same time. So Jesus raises the bar high. He stresses more than once, faithfulness in small matters will lead to more responsibility. A second way we might interpret the parable is in a different way altogether, which focuses on radical forgiveness. The rich man could have fired his manager, but in choosing to praise him for his shrewd actions, he extends to him an inappropriate and radical forgiveness lined with grace. How would you have felt? Would you say he didn't get what he deserved? It seemed unfair, didn't it? An inappropriate and radical forgiveness. But the manager wins honour for the master and himself, and praise from his master, and a secure future for himself. Instead of being unemployed, he has a secure future. And what emerges here is not so much Jesus praising the shrewdness of the man, but what emerges is the power of gracious, generous forgiveness, which changes people's lives. Usually we don't deserve forgiveness when we've done things wrong. Usually we expect consequences, don't we? But here we see this gracious and generous forgiveness. The storyline from the well-known musical Les Miserables demonstrates this powerful principle of change. It's a story set in the turmoil of the 19th century France, a story of poverty and affluence, broken dreams, love and redeeming grace. As the story begins, Jean Valjean is being released from 19 years on the chain gang, paroled back into the world, but shackled with his conviction. It keeps him from being able to start over and make a new life. So in despair, he returns to his life of petty crime. He is caught by the police after stealing silver from the church. You will probably know this story, where a bishop has offered him shelter. When the police bring him back to the church, everything changes because the bishop denies the charges and insists that the silver was a gift and gives Valjean the most valuable candlesticks in the church. Valjean deserves judgment and condemnation, but instead he receives grace. Not just forgiveness for his sins, but an abundance over the top gift. Grace is at the heart of Les Mis. Grace transforms Valjean. The power of this gracious, generous forgiveness changes people's lives. Whichever way we interpret this parable, it is a call to all disciples of Jesus to radical discipleship in the way we use our money and the grace that we extend to our debtors. Jesus makes it clear that our use of money as an important indicator of the strength of our discipleship and our concern for the poor. So the parable tells the story of a manager who forgave the debt of the poor. Imagine a bank doing that. Imagine if they did it for everybody. I wonder if the bank would go bankrupt. I'm not sure they would. I still think they'd have enough money. The rich man did not need any more wealth, but the poor man needed relief from the heavy burden of debt. And many, many, many millions of people in our world today are in that situation. Perhaps this is what Jesus intends for us to take away with us this morning. It is not a foreign concept for us in our current world financial situation. During the 70s and 80s, a build-up of foreign debt caused by corrupt systems of international finance and trade regulations left many poor countries with unsustainable debt burdens. The World Bank and the International Monetary Fund during the 90s provided concessional credits and grants to the poorest countries in the world. At the turn of the millennium, you remember there was a strong focus on forgive the debt, and the United Nations Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs, were signed in September 2000 in the United Nations Millennium Declaration. There were 8 development goals. Number 1, eradicate extreme poverty. Number 2, achieve universal primary education. They're up there on the board. Promote gender equality. Reduce child mortality. Improve maternal health. Combat HIV, AIDS, malaria and other diseases. Ensure environmental sustainability and global partnership for development. The aim was to reduce poverty and bring some balance between the rich and the poor by 2015. Some of you are smiling. You may remember in 2010 the Stand Up Against Poverty campaign, where all people in Australia were asked to join together as a global community to send a powerful message to local, national and world leaders. I remember doing this in church. Did you have Stand Up for Poverty in church one Sunday? Don't remember? No? So in 2015, the United Nations had to amend their goals because they were far from being reached. So they adopted what they called 17 sustainable development goals, ones that could be sustained. This again was a universal call to action to end poverty, protect the planet, and ensure that by 2030 all people would enjoy peace and prosperity. These 17 SDGs are integrated. They recognise that action in one place will affect outcomes in others, and that development must balance social, economic and environmental sustainability. Countries have committed to prioritise progress for those who are furthest behind. They are designed to end poverty, hunger and discrimination against women and girls. The creativity, know-how, technology and financial resources from all of society are necessary to achieve the SDGs in every context. I'm quoting from a document there. So, this stand against poverty would be applauded by Jesus. His gospel message is about the call of God's generous, inappropriate grace and forgiveness which allows for debt to be forgiven, written off, and for effective aid to be given to lift people out of their poverty. Effective aid. The gospel is good news, especially for the poor, the oppressed, the blind and the lame, as Jesus said in Luke chapter 4. So in 2022, given that those 17 sustainable goals had an aim of 2030, are we making progress? Since 2015, well, even before that, at home in Australia, we have seen people reduced to poverty through fire, drought, continuing flooding, and economic hardship as a result of the pandemic. Remember Bob Hawke's election promise in 1987? He said, by 1990, no Australian child will be living in poverty. Do you remember that? Someone has said, what very few people remember is that through the policies Bob Hawke implemented at the time, he reduced child poverty by a full 30%. We have had no Prime Minister do the same since. Don't know who said that, but that's what was quoted. Nearly 35 years on, Bob Hawke's promise remains an elusive goal for us. On the world stage, with the continuing challenges of global warming and the resulting droughts and extreme weather events, conflict, increasing the number of refugees, and of course the COVID pandemic, causing untold suffering, hunger and poverty, as well as loss of income and employment, we can understand that the goal of eliminating world poverty and hunger is a moving target that's going to be very hard to hit or to reach. There are nations whose economies are bankrupt or severely struggling in the aftermath of COVID and other related impacts. Sri Lanka, and fleeting glance at the news last night where there was rioting. Somebody help me? Nobody. Come on, Mary, you should be good at this. Anyway, it's happening in several countries where it's quite extreme. Oh, the place where the banks have closed and people... Lebanon, right? Lebanon. They're in dire straits. When we examine what these Millennium Goals have achieved, and there has been some achievement, one thing we can do then is to look again at how we have managed our own money and resources. We may feel, well, it's hopeless because of the impact of our own world's climate and all those other impacts. Are we ever going to achieve that goal? But we can't say, well, one person doesn't make a difference. So what can we do? We can avoid buying products which exploit child labour. We can avoid buying and using products that exploit the environment and buy, where possible, environmentally sustainable products. We can use our buying power and shopping practices to ensure that fair trade practices are employed. We can ensure that fair wages are paid for those whose produce we buy, and support sustainable practice which protects our Earth's non-renewable practice. Remember the slogan, live simply, so that others may simply live. This is what Wesley did. In his early life, John Wesley began teaching at Oxford University for £30 a year, which was quite a bit of money then. It cost him £28 a year to live, so he gave away £2. The next year his income doubled, but he was still able to live on £28 a year, so he gave away £32. He continued this for some years as his income increased. One year, when his salary was £1,400, he lived on £30 and gave the rest away. He believed that his increase in income should increase his giving rather than his standard of living. It's a great example of Christian discipleship and stewardship when we live in a world that's so oriented towards consumerism. It's too easy, isn't it, everybody, to have spare cash and to spend it on things we don't need. And we're surrounded by stuff when others, even in our own country, do not have basic necessities. So if we come back to our readings for today, if we work to accumulate wealth by unlawful or unethical means, as the rich man did in the parable, we are basically being dishonourable. But if we use our resources and our ethically acquired wealth to lift the burden of another, we are showing our integrity, our generosity, and our compassion. At the same time, we are living out our understanding of Jesus' kingdom values, the reign of God, where everyone gets a fair go. Jesus' call to follow him is not confined to a few areas of our lives. In an age where money is the god of our consumer culture, Jesus makes it clear that how we use our money is an indicator of our faithfulness as his managers or agents. We are called to be faithful managers rather than being concerned about our reputations. In Luke's Gospel, Jesus has more to say about money. Wealth and exploitation, which so often leads to poverty in less developed nations. Let's remember the central message of Jesus' Gospel about the importance of ethical and moral behaviour. So, what are we going to make of all this morning? How are we being faithful and honest with the resources God has given to us? Are we faithful managers of it? How much do we share our resources? Are we good news for the poor?